Hey guys, Devin here with Admiral Off-Road. Today we're doing a segment called Whiteboard Wisdom, and our topic is going to be lifting your Jeep. Now, the lift is going to be, most of the time, the first thing that everybody wants to do when they get a Jeep. So we're going to go over the 4 basic ways to do that and the pros and cons of each. Now, first one we're looking at is spacers and blocks. Now, a spacer, coil spacer, goes in between your coil spring and the body of the Jeep. Now, what that does is it just allows you to keep your stock coil spring and lift it using the rubber. Now, the rubber doesn't compress, so however big of a spacer you buy, that's how much it's going to lift your Jeep. Now, the rear leaf sprung, what you're going to do is you're going to buy a block. That's going to go in between your leaf springs and your axle of your Jeep. It works the same way. That block doesn't compress, so again, however big of a block you buy, that's how much it's going to lift your Jeep. Now, this is going to be your cheapest option because it maintains your stock coil springs and leaf springs, so there's not a whole lot to buy other than the blocks and the spacers themselves. One thing you do have to keep an eye on with this is in the rear, if your leaf springs are a little bit worn out, you might get something called axle wrap. Now, what that is under acceleration, your tires are moving forward, but the opposite force of that is your axle is going to want to roll backwards. If you have worn out springs, what the block is going to do is going to kind of amplify that effect. So it's going to kind of look like this. Now, it'll make your leaf springs kind of go into an S shape. Now, this is going to throw off your pinion angle. It goes from pointing like this now to pointing like that. That's going to cause driveline vibrations and some other problems. So if you do encounter that, you're going to have to step away from the blocks and go to another method. Our second one is going to be what's called a shackle. Again, this is just for the rear of the Jeep, using your leaf springs. The shackle is what connects the Jeep to the leaf springs. You have one in the rear of the Jeep on each side. And unlike the blocks and spacers, however much longer your new shackle is than your stock shackle, you divide that number by 2. What I mean is if your new shackle is 2 inches longer than your stock shackle, you're actually only going to get 1 inch of lift from that. Now, the reason why is you want to keep your shackle at a 45-degree angle. And so, therefore, if it's not straight up and down, if it was straight up and down, 2 inches longer would give you 2 inches of lift. But because it's at a 45-degree angle, 2 inches longer would only give you 1 inch of lift. This is going to change your pinion angle a little bit. So if you do have driveline vibrations, one way you can fix that is through the use of a degree shim. Now, that looks like a block, but because it goes underneath your leaf springs, in between your leaf springs and your axle, but it's shaped like a wedge. So that brings your pinion angle back closer to stock and should get rid of any of the driveline vibrations that you might get from that. Next one is an add-a-leaf. This is where you take your stock leaf springs and you add another leaf spring underneath it. Most of the time it's made of a thicker gauge material, so it'll bend your leaf springs more, give it more arch, and therefore give you more leaf. This is just for the rear, so you can couple that either with a new coil spring for the front or a spacer in the front. One drawback of an add-a-leaf, though, is that because you're using such a thicker material for that one leaf spring, you're going to get a little bit of a stiffer ride back. It's not going to ride quite as soft, but if you're okay with that, then an add-a-leaf is a great option. Last one is a full coil and a full leaf pack. So but this one's the most expensive one, but if you have the money to do it, you're going to get all fresh suspension components. I mean, you get new coil springs, new leaf springs. So everything is completely fresh. You don't have to worry about sagging or anything like that. One thing you do know with your coil springs and your leaf packs is that they're going to have to settle. So when you first buy your coil springs and your leaf springs, you put them underneath your Jeep, it's going to be higher than it is at what's called its final ride height. So it's going to have to settle down a little bit, get used to the weight of the vehicle, and then it'll settle at your desired height. So if you buy a 4.5-inch lift, let's say, you're going to probably start off at around 5 or 5.5 inches, and then after about a week or so, it'll finally settle down to your 4 or 4.5 inches that's set on the box. When you're lifting your Jeep on a budget, the magic number is going to be between 3.5 and 4 inches. Now, the reason why that is because after that range, that 3.5 to 4 inches, you're going to have to start replacing more things than just your coil springs and your leaf springs. The first thing you're going to have to start to think about is your track bar. Now, this is a front view of the Jeep. Your body's up here, your axle's down here, and the track bar I drew in purple. Now, your track bar attaches from the driver's side on the body of the Jeep to the passenger side on the axle. What it does is it keeps your axle from shifting back and forth underneath the Jeep. Now, to demonstrate what happens when you lift your Jeep, if you keep the same length track bar, I'm going to use this ruler. Now, this ruler is the length of our stock track bar. So, when you're driving along at your stock height, your track bar attaches to your body of your Jeep here, into your axle here. Now, when you lift your Jeep, all of a sudden, what happens is that this is your lift, and this is the amount of shift. Now, when you lift your Jeep without changing your track bar, what it does is it shifts the axle over towards the towards the driver's side. Now, the reason why that is because you can see, when I lift it, it doesn't just change straight up and down. Because this is the same length, it has to swing. There's actually a shift that occurs. So when you drive a Jeep that's lifted, if you haven't changed your track bar, you're going to actually see your driver's side tire sticking out farther than your passenger side tire. Now, below 3.5 to 4 inches, this isn't really an issue, but after that, it does start causing more problems. Next one is going to be control arms. Now, your control arms, I drew in purple here. This is going to be your wheel well, this is your axle. Now, when you lift your Jeep, it's kind of the same thing. Your axle is attached to the body of the Jeep by your upper and your lower control arms. Now, when you lift your Jeep, if you don't change the length of your control arms, it shifts your axle in towards the middle of the Jeep. So what it actually does is it, in effect, shortens your wheelbase. Now, to bring that back so your axle is centered underneath your wheel well, is you're going to need to buy longer control arms. Again, under 3.5 to 4 inches, it shifts a little bit, but after that is when it really starts getting in trouble, and you're going to want to either buy longer control arms or control arm drop brackets or even long arms. So there's a couple different options you have there. Next is going to be brake lines. Now, brake lines, this can be an issue below 3.5 to 4 inches if you disconnect your sway bars. So it's definitely something to check whenever you lift your Jeep. You want to make sure that when your axle is fully drooped underneath your vehicle, so if you lift it up and you let your axle drop all the way down, that your brake lines aren't tight. If they are, you're in danger of ripping your brake lines, and you're going to have a lot of issues trying to stop without your brakes. Next is shocks. Again, this can be an issue if you're under 3.5 inches, if you do disconnect your sway bars, but definitely if you're over 3.5 inches, you're going to need new shocks. So make sure you get out and measure your fully drooped length. What I mean by that is if you take all the weight off of the Jeep, you put it up on jack stands and you let your axle droop all the way down, take that measurement, and also under full compression when you bring your axle all the way up. And that's how long you need your shocks to be. Next is what's called a slip yoke eliminator. Now, if you lift your Jeep and you start to get driveline vibrations, so you start feeling vibrations when you're driving on the street, you might need a slip yoke eliminator. Now, this is really a case-by-case basis. Some people need these at 4 inches, some people are okay until 6 inches of lift before they need that. It is a little bit expensive, so one thing you can do in the meantime, until you have enough money for that, is what's called a transfer case drop. Now, underneath the Jeep is a transfer case skid plate, and what you do for a drop is you just basically put spacers in between that skid plate and the body of the Jeep. So what it does is the spacers move your transfer case down, and it drops it down a little bit, and it kind of takes away from some of that lift. Now, you do lose a little bit of clearance underneath the Jeep, right in the middle, but it's only about 1 inch. So, it's something to consider, but it's also a cheaper option than the slip yoke eliminator. Last thing is going to be sway bar links. Now, if you lift your Jeep and you want to keep your sway bars on, you're probably going to need longer sway bar links. Now, you can get quick disconnects. You can pretty much totally get rid of your rear sway bar. I don't run a rear sway bar. I do in the front, and I have quick disconnects that can be had for pretty cheap. So this is kind of the list of things that need to be changed right away after you get over that 3.5 to 4 inches. If you go extreme levels, like way up there, you're going to need to start replacing more and more things. But this is kind of the basic list of everything that needs to be changed after you want to go to that 4.5 plus lift. The last thing we're going to talk about today is a cheap lift that I did on my Jeep right after I bought it. I was still in high school, didn't have a whole lot of money, so I looked around on the internet and was able to kind of piece together a lift. Now, it's called a bastard pack. If you look around on the internet, there's a lot of different versions that people do, and this is mine. Thunderbird coils, or the coil springs that I used up front, they're out of a 1997 Ford Thunderbird. Now, when you get the coil springs, you want to check which model they're from. There's 3 different models of Thunderbird that were in the 90s. There's an LXV6, an LXV8, and a Super Coupe. Now, you're going to want to take the coils out of either the LXV6 or the LXV8. Those are going to be your softest ones, with the LXV6 being the softest, LXV8 being a little bit firmer, and the Super Coupe being the hardest. Now, I ended up going with the LXV8 coils. If I were to do it again, I'd probably go with the LXV6, just be a little bit softer. Now, when you get it, you do have to use the whole strut. So make sure when you buy these, you're not just getting the coil spring, but the whole strut. It's called the McPherson strut. Now what you do is you take the top of the strut and you cut a 2.1-inch hole in it. You then take that top that you cut the hole in and you turn it upside down. That's going to be your new coil isolator. You're going to take the stock one out of the Jeep and you're going to put that in its place. Then you just put your coil up under your new Ford Thunderbird coil up underneath there, and that's going to be your front. Now, if you look at the Jeep Cherokee coils versus the Ford Thunderbird coils, they're about the same length. One's not really that much taller than the other. The lift comes from the Ford Thunderbird coils being a stiffer spring rate than the Jeep Cherokee ones. When you put the weight back on the Jeep, you're not getting as much compression as you would with the stock Cherokee springs. Next, my leaf springs came out of a 1990s Chevy S10. The only thing I had to do to make those fit was I cut the eyes off the main S10 leaf spring, and then I just kept my Jeep Cherokee mainspring. So if I'm looking at my spring pack from top to bottom, it's my Jeep Cherokee mainspring, then my Chevy S10 mainspring, and my Chevy S10 secondary spring. So it's a 3-spring pack, and both of these together both gave me 3.5 inches front and rear. That's not always the case. If you're piecing together a lift, especially with used parts, it doesn't always work out like that, but I did get lucky. I paid $40 for each of those. I got them both on Craigslist, so if you look around, you can get some good deals. Next, my brake lines. I got those for a 1995 Jeep YJ Wrangler. I got those at Napa, so if you try to look online and you want to get aftermarket, longer brake lines, they're going to be a lot more expensive than if you just get stock brake lines for a vehicle that the brake lines are just longer for. So I currently actually have a 4.5-inch lift now, and these brake lines are still the ones I have on my vehicle, so they're plenty long for any 3.5, 4.5-inch lift. For my shocks, I needed longer shocks as well, so I ended up going with Monroe Sensatrack shocks. Again, those are both new, so these two were used, and these two items were both new. Now, these shocks aren't necessarily made for the Jeep Cherokee, so I put their part numbers on there. It's 37029 and 37199. So those are the two part numbers for the front and rear shocks, and they ended up running me about $180. The brake lines run me about $55. So altogether, my whole lift cost me about $315. Now, if you look around and you're looking at lift kits, they normally range between $500 and $800, depending on if you go with blocks on the rear. That'll bring that price down a little bit, and if they don't come with shocks. So basically what my setup is, it's a full leaf pack, and it came with shocks. So if you were to compare that to a full lift kit, it'd probably run you about $600 or $700. So that just goes to show that if you want to take the time to piece together a lift, instead of just going with a quick lift kit, you can actually save yourself quite a bit of money. Again, I spent $315 instead of $600 or $700. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer those. Thanks.